"Pack your bags and leave," my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm enough to sound reasonable, as if she were suggesting I try a new restaurant instead of telling me to walk away from the home I had lived in for over 30 years, and for a moment no one moved. Not even my son sitting right beside her, his eyes fixed on his plate like the pattern in the china mattered more than the words that had just been spoken, and I realized then that this wasn't sudden, it wasn't emotional, it was planned. Rehearsed, decided long before tonight. I felt the weight of the room press against my chest, the smell of roasted chicken still warm in the air, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. Everything painfully ordinary except for the sentence that had just ended my place at that table. I folded my napkin slowly, smoothing it with my fingers the way I had done thousands of times before, and then I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I already knew something they didn't. I had learned just 48 hours earlier when a quiet phone call had interrupted my morning coffee, a call I hadn't expected, from a number I didn't recognize. A voice on the other end asking if I was still living at the Collins residence and whether I was aware of recent changes to certain financial documents. I hadn't been, not then, but I had listened carefully, asked very few questions, and written everything down, the way you do when you sense that the ground beneath your feet is starting to shift. And now, sitting at that dinner table, watching my daughter-in-law sip her wine with that composed little smile, watching my son avoid my eyes as if eye contact might make him responsible, I understood the full shape of it. The quiet rearranging of ownership, the subtle removal of my name from things that used to belong to me, the way drawers had been cleaned out without explanation, the way paperwork had disappeared from the study, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. Small things at first, easy to dismiss, easy to forgive, until they weren't, until they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. I pushed my chair back gently, the legs barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. No one stopped me, no. One said my name, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the one at the end of the hall with the window that overlooked the maple tree my husband had planted the year we moved in. And I paused for just a second at the doorway, taking in the familiar shape of the bed, the dresser, the soft afternoon light stretching across the carpet, and I realized that they thought this was the moment I lost everything, that this was the night I became small. Displaced, forgotten, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I had already begun to move pieces into place long before she ever opened her mouth at that table. And as I reached for the suitcase in the back of the closet, I allowed myself the smallest, quietest breath of clarity, because sometimes the only way to see people clearly is to let them believe you've already lost. The house felt different the moment I closed the bedroom door behind me, not louder, not quieter, just unfamiliar, as if it had already begun adjusting to a version of itself without me in it. I set the suitcase on the bed, but did not open it right away. Instead, I walked slowly to the window and looked out at the backyard, the same stretch of grass I had mowed every summer for years after my husband's knees had given out. The same fence we had painted together one fall afternoon when the air smelled like leaves and wood smoke. Everything still exactly where it had always been, and yet none of it felt like mine anymore. I rested my hand on the edge of the dresser and let my fingers trace the faint scratches along the wood, small marks from decades of use. From life, from ordinary days that had once felt permanent. I thought about that phone call again, the way the man had paused before speaking, as if he was choosing his words carefully, as if he understood that what he was about to say would not just inform me but rearrange something inside me. He had mentioned documents, transfers, signatures, all things that should have included me but somehow did not. And I remembered standing in the kitchen that morning with my coffee growing cold in my hand, listening without interrupting, because something in his tone told me that reacting too quickly would only make me miss what mattered. I sat down on the edge of the bed and finally opened the suitcase, the zipper sliding smoothly, a quiet, controlled sound. I folded my clothes with deliberate care, not rushing, not hesitating, each piece placed neatly inside as if I were packing for a short trip instead of leaving a life behind. Downstairs I could hear faint movement, a cabinet door closing, the low murmur of voices, but no footsteps coming toward me. No knock on the door, no change of heart, and that absence settled over me more heavily than any words could have. I reached for the small wooden box on my nightstand, the one my husband had given me years ago, and opened it. Inside were a few letters, a watch he had worn every day, and a folded document I had not looked at in a long time, not because I had forgotten it, but because I had trusted that I would never need to question it. I held it for a moment without unfolding it, feeling the weight of it in my hands, not heavy in pounds, but in meaning, in certainty, in truth that had been quietly waiting while everything else shifted around it. I placed it carefully into my bag, closed the lid of the suitcase, and stood up, the room now looking less like a place I belonged to and more like a place I had already left. I took one last look at the bed, the dresser, the window, not with sadness, but with clarity, because sometimes the hardest part is not losing a home. It is realizing that it was taken from you long before you were told to leave. When I stepped out of the bedroom with my suitcase in hand, the hallway felt longer than it had ever been, each step measured, steady, controlled, the kind of pace you keep when you do not want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you rush. The light from the kitchen spilled into the corridor, warm and ordinary, as if nothing had changed, as if a life had not just been quietly dismantled at the dinner table. I could see them before they noticed me, Olivia standing near the counter with her arms crossed, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested certainty, and Daniel leaning against the sink, his shoulders slightly hunched, not in regret but in avoidance. He looked up briefly when he heard my footsteps, then away again, like a man watching something he did not want to be responsible for. I paused for a moment at the edge of the room, not to say anything, not to ask any questions, but simply to observe, to confirm what I already understood, that there would be no apology, no hesitation, no sudden realization that perhaps they had gone too far. Olivia glanced at the suitcase and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that her instructions had been followed, as if I had completed a task she had assigned, and in that gesture there was no cruelty, not the loud kind. Just a quiet dismissal, the kind that reduces a person to something temporary, something easily replaced. I set my keys on the table, the same table where I had served countless meals, where birthdays had been celebrated, where my husband had once sat at the head and laughed at stories that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The sound of the keys touching the wood was soft, but final. I noticed then how clean the surface was, how clear, no papers, no clutter. None of the small traces of me that used to exist there, and I understood that this had not begun tonight. This had been happening piece by piece, day by day, until there was almost nothing left to remove. I picked up my coat from the chair by the door, the fabric still holding the faint scent of last winter, and slipped it on slowly, my hands steady, my movements deliberate. No one offered to help, no one said goodbye, and that absence, again, spoke louder than anything else could have. I reached for the front door handle and felt the cool metal under my palm, familiar and distant at the same time. I had opened this door thousands of times before, for groceries, for guests, for my husband when he forgot his keys. And now I was opening it for the last time as someone who belonged inside. I stepped out onto the porch and the evening air met me gently, neither welcoming nor harsh, just present. The sky stretched wide above the quiet street, the same street where neighbors still waved in the mornings and children rode their bikes in the summer, everything continuing exactly as it always had, indifferent to what had just happened behind that door. I did not look back, not because it did not matter, but because I already knew what I would see, a house that no longer recognized me, and people inside it who had already decided I was gone long before I ever walked out. I walked down the short path from the porch to the sidewalk, the wheels of my suitcase making a soft, uneven sound against the concrete, a sound that felt louder than it should have in the quiet of the evening, and for a moment I simply stood there. Not because I did not know where to go, but because I wanted to feel exactly what this moment was, not the version they believed they had created, but the truth of it. I was not being cast out, I was stepping away from something that had already been taken from me piece by piece, and as I stood under the dim glow of the porch light, I found myself thinking of my husband, of the way he used to stand in that very doorway with his arms crossed, pretending to be stern when Daniel came home late as a teenager, only to break into a smile a second later. He had always believed in protecting what we built, not just the house, but the idea of it, the sense that it belonged to us, that it would always be a place of safety. I could still hear his voice sometimes, not as a memory that fades, but as something steady, something that had once guided every decision we made together. And I remembered one particular evening years ago when we had sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, going over papers, documents, signatures, things I had not paid much attention to at the time because I trusted him completely. He had looked at me then with a seriousness that stood out, even now, and said that everything needed to be clear, that nothing we had worked for should ever be misunderstood or misplaced. I had nodded back then, not fully grasping the weight of what he meant, because at the time there was no reason to question anything. Everything felt secure, permanent, untouchable, and yet now, standing outside that same house, I understood that permanence is often just an illusion people rely on until someone decides to rewrite it. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and took a slow breath, the air cool against my face, grounding, steady. And I began to walk, not quickly, not hesitantly, just forward, the street stretching ahead of me in a straight, familiar line. I passed the old mailbox at the corner, the one my husband had insisted on fixing himself instead of replacing, saying it had character, and I almost smiled at the memory, not with sadness, but with a quiet recognition of how different things had become, how the values we once held had been quietly replaced by something colder, more calculated. Something that did not hesitate to remove me when I was no longer convenient. But what they did not understand, what they had overlooked in their careful planning, was that not everything had been within their reach to change, not every document, not every decision, not every safeguard my husband had put in place. And as that realization settled more firmly in my mind, the heaviness I might have expected to feel did not come. Instead, there was a clarity, a calm, almost like stepping into a role I had not intended to play but was now fully prepared to take on, because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer reacting, I was remembering, and in remembering, I was beginning to see exactly where they had made their first mistake. By the time I reached the end of the street, the sky had deepened into that quiet shade of blue that comes just after sunset, when everything slows down and the world feels suspended for a moment, and I stopped beneath a street lamp, setting my suitcase upright beside me. Not because I was tired, but because I needed a moment to think clearly without the walls of that house around me, without their silence pressing in. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, the same phone that had rang 2 mornings ago. And for a second I simply held it, remembering the exact tone of that call, the way the man had introduced himself, polite, careful, not alarmed but not casual either, as if he understood he was stepping into something delicate, something that required precision. He had said his name was Thomas Green, and that he had worked with my husband years ago on several financial matters, that he was reviewing some older records and needed to confirm a few details. At the time I had thought it was routine, something administrative. But then he had asked a question that did not fit. He asked if I had personally authorized any recent changes to property ownership or account designations, and I had told him no, of course not, because I had not signed anything, not recently. Not in months, and there had been a pause on the line, a quiet, measured pause that told me more than his words ever could. He had not said that something was wrong, but he did not need to. The absence of reassurance was enough. I had asked him then, very calmly, what exactly he was seeing, and he had explained, slowly, that certain documents had been filed, documents that suggested a transfer of control, a shift in authority, and while everything appeared legal on the surface, there were inconsistencies, small ones, but enough to raise concern. I remember standing in my kitchen, looking at the sunlight hitting the countertop, listening to him list dates and signatures that did not belong to me, and realizing that someone had been moving things quietly, carefully, assuming I would never notice, assuming I would never ask. And now, standing under that street lamp, I understood the full weight of that conversation. This had not been an emotional decision made at a dinner table. It had been a process, calculated, executed step by step, long before tonight. I unlocked my phone and scrolled to his number, my thumb hovering for just a second before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, and then he answered. His voice the same as before, steady, professional, as if he had been expecting this moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain what had just happened. I simply said my name and asked if we could meet in person. There was a brief silence, and then he agreed without hesitation, giving me an address downtown, an office building I recognized but had not visited in years. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag, my mind clear now in a way it had not been before, because everything that had felt uncertain just hours ago was beginning to align into something precise, something I could follow. I picked up my suitcase again and stepped forward into the quiet street, not as someone who had been pushed out, but as someone who finally understood the game that had been played around her and was now ready to play it back. I arrived at the office building just after 9 the next morning, the kind of place that looked the same no matter how many years passed: tall glass doors, polished floors, a quiet lobby that carried the faint scent of coffee and paper. I paused for a moment before stepping inside, adjusting my grip on the handle of my suitcase, not out of hesitation but out of habit, the same small gesture I had made countless times before entering unfamiliar spaces. Only this time there was something different, a steadiness I had not felt in a long while. I walked up to the front desk and gave my name. The receptionist nodded politely and directed me to the elevator, her tone neutral, unaware of the weight of the meeting I was about to have. The elevator ride was short, but in those few seconds I found myself replaying the last few days in my mind, not with confusion anymore, but with a kind of quiet organization, each detail falling into place, each moment connecting to the next with a clarity that had been missing before. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a hallway lined with offices, each door marked with small, precise lettering, and at the end of the corridor I saw the name I was looking for, Thomas Green. I knocked once, firmly. And when he opened the door, his expression shifted almost immediately, recognition followed by something else, something closer to concern than surprise. He stepped aside and invited me in. The office was simple, organized, not overly decorated, just a desk, a few chairs, and shelves filled with neatly arranged files, the kind of space that suggested everything had a place and nothing was left to chance. I sat down across from him and placed my bag beside the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. He did not rush into conversation. Instead, he studied me for a brief moment, as if assessing whether I already understood what he was about to say, and then he began. He explained again what he had mentioned over the phone, but this time with more detail, more precision. Documents had been submitted transferring certain authorities, signatures had been recorded, approvals had been processed, all of it appearing valid at a glance. But when he compared them to older records, to original signatures, to documents my husband had finalized years ago, the differences became clear, subtle, but undeniable. I listened without interrupting, my eyes focused on the folder he had placed on the desk between us, a thin folder, but heavy in implication. He opened it and turned it toward me, pointing to specific lines, dates, names, and I saw it then. Not just the changes, but the intent behind them. This had not been done in a moment of impulse. It had been constructed, layered carefully to look legitimate, to pass unnoticed, to ensure that by the time I realized what had happened, it would already be too late. I felt a brief tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from the realization of how deliberate it had all been, how confidently they had assumed I would never question it. Thomas leaned back slightly and folded his hands, his voice calm but firm as he asked if I had authorized any of these actions. I shook my head once, slowly, and he nodded as if that confirmed what he had already suspected. There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, but significant, and in that silence I understood something important. This was the moment where most people would react, would express anger, confusion, betrayal, but I did none of those things. Instead, I looked at him and asked a single question: what options do I have? He held my gaze for a second before answering, and when he did, his tone shifted slightly. No longer just informative, but strategic. as if he had been waiting for me to ask that exact question. And as he began to outline the steps, the possibilities, the ways this could be addressed, I felt that same clarity settle deeper inside me. The kind that does not come from emotion, but from understanding exactly where you stand, because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer the one being moved. I was the one deciding what would happen next. I left Thomas Green's office with a folder in my hand and a plan. That was still forming, but already sharp enough to follow. The hallway outside looked the same as when I arrived, quiet, orderly, unchanged, but I was not the same person walking through it now. I stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers descend slowly, each floor bringing me closer not just to the street, but to the next part of what needed to be done. Thomas had not spoken in dramatic terms. He had not used words like betrayal or wrongdoing. He had simply laid out facts, timelines, signatures, and possibilities, and within those possibilities was something they had clearly not considered, that everything they had done could be questioned, traced, and, if necessary, undone, but not through confrontation, not through anger, through patience, through precision, through letting them believe their version of events was complete. I stepped out into the morning air and paused for a moment on the sidewalk, the city already moving around me, people heading to work, cars passing by, everything continuing without interruption, and I realized how easy it was for something significant to happen quietly, without anyone else noticing. I adjusted the folder under my arm and began walking, not toward the house, not yet, but toward a small cafe a few blocks away, the kind of place I used to visit years ago, where no one would ask questions and no one would recognize me as anything other than another customer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the soft sound of conversation and the smell of fresh coffee wrapping around me. I ordered a cup and chose a table near the window, setting the folder down carefully in front of me. I did not open it right away. Instead, I sat there and watched the street outside, giving myself time to think without rushing, because rushing was exactly what they would expect, an emotional reaction, a mistake, a misstep, but that was not what this required. I finally opened the folder and looked again at the documents, the names, the dates, the signatures that were not mine, and I noticed something Thomas had pointed out earlier, a detail so small it could be overlooked, but once seen, impossible to ignore, a sequence of approvals that did not align, a timing that suggested coordination, not coincidence. I closed the folder again and rested my hands on top of it, steady, calm. And I began to think not about what they had done, but about what they believed. They believed I would leave quietly and disappear. They believed that once I was out of the house, the rest would follow naturally, that ownership would settle in their favor, that time would erase any questions, and that belief was their greatest mistake, because it gave me exactly what I needed: space, distance, and the advantage of being underestimated. I finished my coffee slowly, stood up, and gathered my things, the plan now clearer than it had been before, not complicated, not rushed, but deliberate. I would not go back to confront them, not yet. I would let them settle into their certainty, let them move forward thinking everything was resolved. Because sometimes the strongest position is not the one where you stand your ground, but the one where you step back just far enough for others to reveal exactly how far they are willing to go. And as I walked back out into the street, the city noise rising around me, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me, not anger, not sadness, but control, the quiet, steady kind that does not need to announce itself, because it knows exactly when the moment will come to be seen. I did not return the next day, or the day after that, and I knew they would notice, not immediately, but gradually, in small ways that would begin to unsettle them. The house would feel different without me moving through it. Without the quiet routines I had maintained for years, the absence of something familiar often creates more noise than its presence ever did, and I imagined Olivia first, standing in the kitchen, opening cabinets, adjusting things that did not need adjusting. Her confidence still intact but beginning to search for confirmation, and Daniel, moving from room to room with that same avoidance in his eyes, not questioning what had happened, but not entirely comfortable with the silence either. I gave them time. Not out of hesitation, but because time was part of the plan. Thomas had explained it clearly. The strength of a case is not only in what you prove, but when you choose to reveal it, and rushing would only give them a chance to react, to adjust, to protect themselves, so instead I stayed exactly where I needed to be. In a small extended stay hotel just outside the downtown area, a simple room, clean, quiet, nothing personal, nothing that tied me to anything but the present moment. I kept my routine steady, mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons reviewing documents, evenings making calls that were brief, precise, and always purposeful, each step building quietly on the one before it. Thomas worked alongside me, never rushing, never dramatizing, just aligning facts, verifying records, tracing timelines that began to reveal a pattern too structured to dismiss. And as those pieces came together, something else became clear. This had not been a single decision made by one person. It had been coordinated, discussed, agreed upon. The kind of planning that assumes success long before the outcome is secured, and that assumption was exactly where they had gone wrong, because they had not accounted for resistance, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that waits, observes, and then moves. With certainty, after 3 days, Thomas called and told me everything was ready, not finished, but ready for the next step, and I understood what that meant without needing further explanation. I packed my folder carefully into my bag, stood for a moment in the center of that small room, and looked around, not with attachment, but with acknowledgement. This space had been temporary, a place to think, to prepare, to transition from one version of my life to another, and now that transition was complete. I checked out at the front desk with a polite nod, no conversation, no delay, and stepped back out into the morning light, the air clear, steady, unchanged, just like the first night I had left, but everything inside me was different now. I got into the car Thomas had arranged, the engine starting with a soft hum, and as we pulled onto the road, I did not feel like someone returning to something lost. I felt like someone arriving exactly where they needed to be, because this was no longer about leaving. It was about what happens when you come back with the truth in your hands and the patience to use it at the right moment. I stepped out of the car and onto the driveway as if I had never left, the same gravel beneath my shoes, the same quiet house standing exactly where it had always been. Nothing visibly changed, and yet everything had shifted. Thomas walked beside me, but slightly behind, not leading, not following, simply present. The front door was closed, just as I had left it, and for a brief moment I looked at it, not with hesitation, but with a clear understanding of what it represented now. Not home, not belonging, just a place where decisions had been made without me. I reached forward and knocked once, firm, steady, the sound echoing slightly through the stillness inside. It took a few seconds before I heard movement, footsteps approaching, the lock turning, and then the door opened. Olivia stood there first, her expression composed but not relaxed, the kind of composure that comes from expecting control, not interruption. Her eyes moved quickly from me to the man beside me and back again, and in that brief shift I saw it, the first crack, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. Daniel appeared behind her a moment later, his posture stiff, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something he did not want to name. I did not step inside immediately. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there and held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, long enough for him to understand that something had changed. That whatever version of me had walked out of this house days ago was not the same one standing here now. Thomas spoke then, calm, measured, introducing himself in a tone that carried no emotion but full authority. He explained the purpose of the visit in clear, precise terms, no accusations, no dramatic language, just facts, documents, discrepancies that required clarification. Olivia's posture shifted slightly, her arms no longer as relaxed, her attention now fully focused, calculating. Daniel stepped back instinctively, creating space without realizing it, as if distance might somehow soften what was being presented. I walked past them then, slowly, deliberately, and into the house, not asking permission, not waiting for acknowledgement. The familiar layout unfolding around me exactly as I remembered, but I moved through it differently now, not as someone returning, but as someone reclaiming clarity, Thomas laid the folder on the table, opening it with the same careful precision I had seen in his office, pointing to signatures, dates, inconsistencies that did not require explanation once seen. Silence filled the room, not empty, but heavy. Olivia spoke first, her voice controlled but sharper now, asking questions that sounded less like confusion and more like defense. Thomas answered each one without hesitation, without raising his tone, and with every response, the structure they had built began to lose its shape. Daniel said very little, his silence no longer neutral but revealing. I watched them both, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of final understanding. This was never about a single moment at a dinner table. It was about choices made long before that night. Choices they believed would never be challenged. When the conversation ended, there was nothing left to argue, no confusion to hide behind, just the quiet presence of truth placed clearly in front of them. I closed the folder gently and picked it up, my movements calm, unhurried. I did not look for an apology. I did not wait for one, because what needed to be said had already been said without words. I turned and walked toward the door, the same door I had left 3 days ago, but this time the weight of it felt different, not like something closing behind me, but like something I was choosing to leave behind completely. I stepped outside into the daylight, the air steady and unchanged, and without looking back, I walked forward, not carrying the house with me, not carrying them, only carrying the certainty that I no longer needed either.